Some of those are part of what Brian's talking about here, but I've talked to a lot of guys who were top growers and just didn't find winter wheat working, and now they're back into it. So it's something to reconsider. This crop right behind us here is actually a winter pea. And the reason I think it has been a little bit harder here, say versus Lethbridge, is simply because you're actually a little bit further away from the mountains. You get colder winters, plain and simple. You may be hot in the summer, but you get colder winters than us. But this year we had a pretty mild winter, and you can see we actually had really good luck with our winter peas, which are quite weak on the overall winter survivability as far as crops are concerned. But they look pretty good this year. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it off to Brian.
Thanks, Ken. Wonder if that guy's gonna shut his truck off. I was gonna take you guys up there first. So yeah, let's do that. I want to talk a little bit about this marketing issue too, given that we're at the day of change. Okay, we'll just gather around here and we'll get going so we can maybe get you caught up with your time here. I like the comment that was made about some of the reasons why you wouldn't grow winter wheat. One of them was it's too cheap or something, and the other one was difficult making protein. I really wonder, and some of the breeders that are breeding for milling quality might not want to hear this, but I really wonder how important protein is going to be relative to how important it has been. And in terms of pricing, I'll give you a story I heard last week. We're just in the process of developing our second round of priorities for research and where we want to target that research effort. And one of the guys who heads up Ducks Unlimited, Paul Thorogood, is also a farmer in sort of south central Saskatchewan. And his friend phoned him, who he enticed to be a relatively, I think, probably first time grower this year. And he phoned Paul and he said his worst crop, or his worst field, was the one he was harvesting first. And it was going at 80 bushels per acre. And he sold it off the combine for $7.20 a bushel. And so he didn't have to bin it, and it's going directly at $7.20. He gets the check immediately. And care to guess what the protein was? 9.5. So if they're selling it for, so that went number 3 CWRW. And so I think one of the selling points of winter wheat has always been you can get it off early and you can inject cash flow into your operation fast. I think that advantage is gonna swing way up now. If that's not just a one-off, and I don't really think it will be, I think that's sort of gonna be the trend as we go forward. Protein, shooting for really high protein just isn't gonna be as important as it was in the era of the Canadian Wheat Board. At least that's the indication we're seeing right now. And so, you know, and some of the other barriers to adoption, I think we're in the process of breaking down. So I think this is a really good time for winter wheat, and I think we're hovering at about 1.5 million acres. We've sort of swung back up and stabilized around there. There's no reason at all why we shouldn't have as many acres as there are Durham from a marketing business standpoint for farmers. I think you can make as much and have this cereal phase produce as much money as some of the others. So one of the things we focused on in this project was if we're to entice new growers, one of the big barriers to adoption is stand establishment. So a lot of the experiments that we're going to be talking about, a few of them are here, but a lot of the focus is targeting that. How do we really increase and maintain stand establishment through that winter? So for example, behind you here is some integrated nutrient management experiments. I won't get into too much detail here, but for those of you that are, there's a few growers now that are getting into that, but we're also hitting a phase, whether or not you're talking about spring or winter wheat, where we're getting into this precision farming and this idea of prescriptive in-crop applications of nitrogen or a nutrient package. And so what we've done here is we've taken what's called the green seeker technology, and basically it's an optical sensor that's shooting a beam of light, receiving it back, And based on the amount of that light that's absorbed versus reflected back to the instrument, it tells that unit how much N that plant or that field needs as you go along. And so that's big in the States, obviously, with corn production, but it's something that's coming up here. The problem with that technology is that all the algorithms, so what the green seeker's seeing and what it's telling to put on for nitrogen is all based on winter wheat production in the US. And so we need to update that with winter wheat production in Western Canada. So what you see behind me, if you want to take a look at it later, there's things like FPR, that's a farmer practice rate. So we're teaching the green seeker what types of different rates and scenarios you might come across, whether it's all at seeding, split applications, and then where you see GS, that's what green seeker told us to put on that, that plot. The other thing that was a really big question was the whole idea around seed treatments. So we had two anecdotal reports we were working from. One said that if you put a seed treatment on a winter wheat in the fall, you would delay emergence. The other one said if you put a seed treatment on the fall, you would actually speed up and gain a few days. It would come up earlier. So with that sort of disagreement out there and a lot of products being offered, we thought it was time to take a look at that. And so that's one of the first experiments we're going to look at down here. So if you want, follow me, please. Okay, so one of the reasons I really enjoy agronomy research is because it's a system science. What you guys do on your farm, you're running a cropping system. So our research needs to match up with the real world scenario. So a lot of what you'll see with our work is integrating multiple factors. And this is an example here. These are a range of different agronomic systems that incorporate three factors: seeding rate, seed quality, and the use of a seed treatment or not. So our seeding rates here are either 200 seeds per square foot or 400. Per square meter. That would be 20 seeds per square foot or 40 seeds per square foot. With winter wheat, we want to see growers probably around 450 actually. So we went with 200 and 400 just for ease in this particular one. There are many of you in the crowd that haven't moved over to the dark side and started growing winter wheat, so I'll give you some of the information we've got on spring wheat responses as well. Some of the things recently, whether it's a solid stem spring wheat, hollow stem spring wheat, or durum, and particularly in the case of durum, I just completed and published a study where even through 450 seeds per square meter, we were seeing a positive response to grain yield. So if you're down around 300, with your spring wheat, you need to be thinking about boosting that up and experimenting with 400. We first tried 400 with spring wheat, I think, back in 2001, and there was a farmer down by Etsicum that thought we were crazy to do that with durum until he saw the plots. And I'm pretty sure he's at that rate himself now. So even with spring wheat, and you've heard it with canola, you've heard it with a lot of the crops, those higher seeding rates, because we've raised our genetic potential for yield, it's the same situation we had with hybrid corn years ago, where to match that, to obtain that higher yield potential, you need to go with a little bit higher plant population. And with that, you also gain better competition with weeds and all that good stuff. The only exception on the spring wheat side would be we want to keep that around 300 to 350 for solid stem spring wheat if you're growing that. Any higher and you're going to start getting more hollow than you want. So anyway, back to the winter wheat. So we've got a seeding rate of 200 or 400, so weak or strong in the way of plant density. And then we did seed quality, seed quality. So we took a seed lot of CDC buteo and we just ran it through a seed cleaner. And the heavies that scalped off the top, we called our heavy seed. Anything that fell all the way through was our thin seed. And the regular seed lot was our moderate seed. And so that's your proxy for seed vigor, seed quality. So light obviously wouldn't be so hot for seed vigor. And you combine that with low plant population and no seed treatment is what you get here. This one isn't as drastic of a difference as we've seen in Lethbridge, but I would see even visually here it's a little bit better. So would anybody like to guess what we're doing here versus here? That's a good guess, but it's not the right answer. That's what I would have guessed before I actually did this experiment. So light seed, so we don't have very good seed quality. We've got a low plant population and no seed treatment. And then what we did here, same seed lot, so it's poor seed, it's a light planting density, but we just put a seed treatment on. And the difference, this is growing all across all 3 prairie provinces, and the difference at every site is the same thing. With this very weak agronomic system, you put a seed treatment on, and the difference is very apparent, and you significantly improve your grain yield. The question is, does that change maintain itself across all agronomic systems? So this is our weakest system here, and our strongest one is down at the end. So here we've stayed with the low plant population, but now we've got the regular seed lot, and either we haven't or we have put on the seed treatment. So even in this one, I think you can see a bit of an improvement going with the seed treatment versus not. So where it starts to get a little iffy is when you do have the stronger agronomic system. So now we've bumped up our seeding rate to something more normal, 400. It's still in my mind a little bit light for winter wheat, and we're still using the poor seed, but that effect of the seed treatment, either without it or with it, starts to diminish. So I think if you started back there and walked this way, you would probably agree with me that this is one of the better looking plots, right? So this is probably our strongest agronomic system right here. We've got 400 seeds per square meter that we planted. We've got the heavy or good quality seed, and we've put on the dual fungicide insecticide. And which brings me back to the whole, this idea of either Cruiser Max Vigor Trigger or the Raxel WW, which is this one. There's evidence, now we're starting to see that there's a difference, right? Especially at that poor agronomic system. The seed treatments seem to give it a bump, give it an advantage. So where's the mechanism behind that? And that's one thing to think about. The thought is, some preliminary research coming out, is that it's coming from the insecticide. So when we talk about advantage with seed treatments, at least specific to these experiments, it's going back to and talking about that combination product where you've got a dual fungicide and insecticide packaged into one. And in this case, you've got 2 chemistries of fungicides packaged with the insecticide.
So are you saying there's sort of a synergy there kind of thing?
Well, I don't know if there's a synergy between the fungicide and the insecticide per se, but there's some evidence that was done out east that would suggest that if you went fungicide alone versus insecticide alone, it seems to be that it's those neonicotinoids that are giving that seed some advantage. The next thing we'll do is we'll walk over to an experiment where we've teased all those out, and you can see for yourself whether or not you think you're seeing anything there or not. So now we're going for a walk.
400 plants per square meter, what's that equate to in pounds per acre?
Well, that's a good question. So that's not 400 plants, that's 400 seeds. So, I like to talk about seeds going into the ground because that's what we've got control of, right? The target density thing, I think, is it's too much of a hypothetical for me. I can't really understand that or predict that. What I can predict is what I put in my drill and put in the ground. And so the emphasis from our standpoint and what you see in this experiment is make sure you've got good quality seed, your vigor's up and your germination is up, and then shoot for about, going into the ground, 450 seeds. Now you're supposed to these days think in density because,
My drill hasn't got that setting though.
yeah, fair enough. I need to say that. So one thing you might see now with KVD gone, KVD sort of held in check seed size, right? Seed shape and size. And that sort of would stabilize and give you a more uniform kernel count. With that going by the wayside and winter wheat being notorious for variations in seed size and shape, your kernel weight fluctuates a lot. And so that's why we want to talk about seed density instead of a volume weight, because the kernel weight changes the volume weight. But if you a crude conversion would be about, if I said I want to see you seeding at 450, your planting weight would be about 2.25 to 2.5 bushels per acre. Yeah. So if you're not at if you're not at 120 pounds per acre, you need to revisit what and do some experimenting. And like I said, we're seeing that response with a lot of our spring wheat studies as well. Yeah, that's heavy. And yeah, and depending on, you know, especially with winter wheat, if you're planting at an ideal time with great conditions, you know, planting density isn't as critical. But if you start getting later and later into the fall, you know, there are two things are going to happen. You're either going to be late with maturity or you're going to have some winter kill, because it won't winter over as well as it would in an ideal situation. So it's very important to compensate by pumping and make sure those seed rates are up high in that situation, because that's all. The other thing you're going to gain is you're going to gain a more uniform canopy and a little bit earlier maturity with those higher seeding rates.
Brian, have you monitored the wireworm populations in these various research plots or not?
We have Dr. Bob Vernon out of our Agassiz Center is sort of the wireworm guy. He's an entomologist working out of there. We put traps in a few of the sites last year in the other experiment we're going to walk over and have a look at. I don't have the information back on that from Bob yet, but that's one thing we're trying to tease out and chasing.
I would say that we're seeing a lot more wireworm in the fields generally now.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I mean, the feedback we're getting is the same thing. And that's a tricky little beast to manage, right? Because a lot of these insecticides sort of just put it to sleep for a while, kind of like a bad drunk, and then it wakes up again and it starts to wake up and go to town on your crop again. But anyway, let's go for a walk. Yeah, the other thing we're doing is working with a new chemistry. In our particular experiment, it's for the control of downy and Japanese brome. And we're seeing some really nice positive results with that. This is year one. It's a product called pyroxasulfone, and it's only registered right now down east for corn and soybeans, I think. But the data we're collecting on it, A, looks good for control of those two weeds, and B, we can use that data to get minor use registration on. So we could have something new in the way of a new chemistry here pretty soon. And which would be very nice, particularly for Japanese brome, downy brome. Those are things that are actually increasing in terms of weed competition with winter wheat. But anyway, so this experiment here, we're looking at two things here. One, we've separated out all those chemistries I talked about. So we've separated out the fungicide, the two fungicides. So tebuconazole was the one fungicide that's a seed treatment. Metalaxyl was the other one. And then the imidacloprid, which is the insecticide. So those are our three separate seed treatment ones. And then we're comparing that with naked seed, no seed treatment, or the dual, the Raxil WW. And we're using Bayer products here for two reasons. One is they agreed and were willing to help us with this. And if it wasn't, frankly, for Monica Claus with Bayer the first year, it would have been impossible for us to do this, because this involves me going out and buying cement mixers, throwing the seed in, squirt bottles, putting this stuff on, because a lot of it's not commercially available. So by doing those and separating it out like that, that allows us to, when we see a response at a site, to try and flesh out what exactly that mechanism was related to. Was it the metal axle? Was it the tebuconazole? Was it the imidacloprid? And the other thing we did with this one, quite honestly, it was a deal where we thought, let's try this because it's probably not a good idea. And it was going in the fall and putting on an application of Proline, so a fall fungicide application, around 2-3 leaf stage, whatever it was, around mid-October. The idea there was, does that application of an in-crop foliar in the fall give us any sort of protection in terms of stand establishment, survival, whatever? And we thought, that's quite a pie in the sky thought to have, but better us to try it than you. Ironically, we also had quite a severe stripe rust outbreak at several sites, including places like Melfort, Saskatchewan, which never gets stripe rust. Had a terrible epidemic of it in the fall of 2010. We were hit hard out by Lethbridge. We had it at 2 sites. Ken had it at his site, and I had it at a site southeast of the airport. And we also had an outbreak at Scott, Saskatchewan. So those 3 sites where we had a confirmed stripe rust outbreak, and where we put fall Proline on, we significantly improved our grain yield over no in-crop foliar fungicide. And the interesting thing that we're seeing this year, and that wasn't really something you could see visually, nor were some of those seed treatment responses, but the one thing we're seeing this year is we've had a tremendous amount of leaf spot issues in the spring, right? And so, especially at Lethbridge, at our one site, where we had the fall Proline put on and where we didn't, it looks like our leaf spot or canopy looks cleaner. So what I would say about that would be, if you've confirmed that you've got stripe rust at your site in the fall, it would be a good idea to consider an application in the fall rather than wait. Because there's a couple of issues that have come up in the spring. One is, a lot of guys were trying to tank mix their herbicides with fungicides in the spring this year. And they were coming in, there's 2 issues with that. The one thing is, if you think about effective timing of weed removal, which is early, versus when you're supposed to be targeting or when you would be applying an in-crop foliar at an economic threshold, I don't see how the 2 would ever coincide at the right time. We can get across our fields faster than ever, but a lot of guys wanted to do that because they're in a bit of panic. They had good crops, they wanted to protect that yield potential, but they went in a bit late. And I'm actually reviewing a manuscript for the Canadian Journal of Plant Science right now, out east, where they looked at that very thing. And where there was a problem, an antagonism between the 2 causing injury in the winter wheat, it was those late applications. So I would be very, very reluctant to go gung-ho and be tank mixing herbicides with fungicides because of that timing thing. And there'll be more information coming. We're going to be doing some work on that as well. And I'm sure the pathologists are as well. But that's one thing that's a bit of a red flag that we saw this year. A fellow came to me and he asked me whether or not he should spray fungicide on his winter wheat. I looked at it and I said, don't do it. You're not at an economic threshold. He was like, well, I got to get out there anyway to whatever he was doing. And he went out there and he left the test strip. And sure enough, where he applied the foliar, he fried his crop. It actually looked worse than his test strip. His test strip stayed clean, stayed below economic thresholds, but he ran into issues with that foliar. But if you've got stripe rust in the fall, that's a different story. So what we have here then, and this goes back to a seeding rate thing too. We've got a nice seeding rate of 450, so these differences aren't going to be that striking. So if you look here, this is a check, naked seed, no seed treatment at all. Looking pretty good. This is the same thing, only we've put that fall Proline down here. I don't know, I don't have any information on what we had for any sort of pathogens in the fall, so I can't comment. I would say, I don't know that I would say that one looks better. Same, I don't know. Hard to say, right? So this is the fungicide one. This is the tebuconazole seed treatment, and that's the same seed treatment package with that fall foliar. This is metalaxyl, and then metalaxyl with a fall foliar. And I would say there's no difference there at all. Here's that insecticide. So this is the imidacloprid. That looks pretty good for a seed treatment. I think we've got issues with the cedar itself. I think we were having issues with one of the runs. So if it's looking like a patchy spot there, there was an issue, right? So kind of ignore that and try to look at the canopy beside it. Again, fall proline. And then this is what you would have as a product. So this is the dual. This is the Raxil WW, and with the Raxil with the fall proline. That's pretty close. That one might look a little bit better. And I think I'll end it at that. So any questions?
What chemical are used for downy broom? They're going to get foxtail barley too?
I don't know, we haven't looked at that, but it's a broad spectrum herbicide that seems to be controlling a lot more things than we thought. We're looking at it in another experiment where we're underseeding cleavers and wild oats. So we're targeting 4 weed species, and I think, what would you say, Ken? You've probably looked at those plots more than I have.
Yeah, no,
The control is pretty good until you know, the injury you only see on the crop is when you go at a crazy high rate, right?
Mm-hmm. You remember it's a fall applied residual chemical, so downy brome, foxtail barley is usually up pretty early, so if it's got activity on downy brome and Japanese brome, I would expect it to do something to the foxtail.
Is that liquid or dry?
Liquid.
Did you try this on other varieties too, or just the Buteo?
We stuck with one variety, Buteo, just because we didn't want to bring in genetics into this one. I've done some other work with other genetics. I think, you know, if there was a seed treatment by genetics interaction, we're going to see that in this other experiment that we've got going on. We've got 4 different varieties, 2 spring and 2 winters, where we're going with Cruiser Max and some in-crop foliars there. So we'll be able to tease that out there. There's a new variety out that I'm pretty high on for growers out in the western prairies, and that's Moats. So if you're a winter wheat grower, I'd be looking to get some of that if you're targeting a milling. There's some nice general purpose ones as well, and the variety trials that way. As you're walking back to the tent, you can have a look at some of them. But Moats is going to be a nice one for the western prairies.
I could make a quick comment on that. You're probably getting at, you've heard that there's potential genetic specificity to the reaction of the insecticide. We did run a couple of trials for Syngenta looking at a number of different varieties and different fall cereals, such as fall rye. We even had winter barley in there, something that's a little bit weaker. And from what I saw in the 2 trials that we did run is that, yeah, sometimes we saw a response and sometimes we didn't. And in talking to the folks at Syngenta anyways, is they're really keen on this idea. And then I think that there is some pretty clear evidence that there is I don't know what you call it, a vigor boost or whatever it may be, but they don't know why. And that's something that they're still trying to figure out as far as that, and then that it is genetic specific. So I guess it's something to keep in mind when moving forward. If you're expecting some kind of a vigor boost by putting that insecticide treatment down, is that it may depend on what variety you're growing. Does that make sense?
It's possible there's an insecticidal by genetic interaction there. Yeah, but it's definitely been, they've definitely teased out the fact there's something in that particular insecticidal chemistry that's probably more at root to the response than for sure the fungicides. So
Yeah.
So it's that combination product. You know, if you're just using a fungicide seed treatment, I don't even know if you do that anymore. You probably wouldn't see.
Insecticide stuff's expensive. So
Yeah.
there's not a lot of guys that are full board on it yet.
Yeah. Well, 2 things there. The economics of it paid off for us so far using it. The other thing we really need to do is, if we're going to advocate, even, you know, as an insurance policy, using seed treatments, I think we need to find out if there's an interaction between that seed treatment and soil health. because it's you know, the insecticide's wiping out your soil biota. So is that a concern or not? So we're going to study that in this next round too.
Join me in thanking Brian. Please.